Hello everybody. This video is going to be all about racism and sexism. Now, really quickly, what I want to address is how social psychology addresses racism and sexism, because it's slightly different than how they're addressed in, popular culture and in the way people talk about it on the news and in your everyday conversation. So very often, there is the assumption that racism involves beliefs of superiority, and sometimes that's true, but it doesn't necessarily always have to be true. In general, we treat racism and sexism like any attitude, really, but an attitude directed at a race or sex. So sexism tends to involve a attitude towards a particular sex. Typically, we think of sexism as involving a negative attitude towards a particular sex, and we think of racism as involving a negative attitude towards a particular race. So, very often you hear about people who are behaving in a sexist manner. This typically it means that they have behaved in a way that implies that they have a negative attitude of most commonly in our culture of women, although people can talk about people being sexist against men, and we very often hear about people being racist in terms of in this culture, white Americans being racist against non-white Americans, but certainly non-white Americans can be racist and therefore hold negative views towards other races as well. So, racism isn't confined to one race, and sexism isn't confined to one sex. In general, we treat racism and sexism, again, as a negative attitude held towards one sex or towards one race. Okay? Now, there are certain kinds of sexism that are almost completely societally dismissed as being problematic, as being bad. And we typically refer to that collection of sexist behaviors as hostile sexism. So very often you might hear about men who think that women aren't as intelligent, that women can't do the same kinds of, perform as well in academic avenues, can't do the same kinds of jobs, etc., etc., etc. And while men and women do certainly have differences, there are far fewer differences than there are commonalities. So one select difference is that, yes, on average, men are bigger than women. Just look at the average body size. Men, and I don't mean like look. I mean there are numbers. You can look up measurements. Men on average have larger body mass than women. On average, men tend to be stronger than women. Yes, certainly there are some women who are stronger than some men. That is entirely possible and does happen. But if we look at the averages, the average for men's strength is higher than women. And then obviously there are reproductive differences. Men cannot bear a child to term. A woman can. So certainly there are differences. But again, there are far fewer differences than there are similarities. Certainly, there are no well-documented intelligence differences. In fact, there is it's commonly believed that women don't perform as well as men do in math. This actually isn't true. Women perform just as well as men in math. So, whereas some of the differences that are believed to be out there don't exist, some differences do. But hostile sexism tends to revolve around this idea that, the version of it that we most often see is that, or hear about, is that men are superior and have more abilities than women in domains X, Y, and Z. Many of the more problematic ones involve domains of competence. Now, there's also a type of sexism that in certain subcultures and for the majority of American history has been commonly accepted across the entire country. But there's a certain kind of sexism that is, even today, largely culturally approved of. And this is, we call this type of sexism benign sexism. So benign sexism, it's called benign because from the perspective of the person behaving in the way, there's not necessarily any kind of negative motive. The man doesn't, if a man is engaging in benign sexism against a woman, they may not necessarily be thinking, oh, that woman is inferior and I'm better than them, and so I need to do that because clearly they can't. That's not necessarily the motive or even the thought process. Instead, benign sexism tends to revolve around this idea of wanting to help, but that desire to help, although benign in and of itself, is still built on a belief that women can't do certain tasks or are not as capable of doing certain tasks as men are. One basic belief is that women may be more likely to hurt themselves than men are. And that's ironic because women, one of those sex differences, women actually have a higher pain threshold than men do. So women can actually endure more pain than men can. So it's kind of funny that there's this inherent belief that, women might be more likely to hurt themselves than men. So again, we have hostile sexism, which refers to this inherent belief that, again, the version of it that we hear most often is that women are inferior, they can't do the things that men can, and then the women should just keep their place off not doing those things that men are better at. Whereas benign sexism tends to be it comes from a different, it's driven by a different motive, a motive to help, but it's built on a belief that women are not necessarily as capable as men. All right. Now, racism, again, is that negative attitude towards a racial group. Now, both of these, sexism and racism, both involve they both involve stereotypes, which are the information you have about a group, prejudice, which is that evaluation that do you like or dislike a particular group, and discrimination. How do you behave towards a certain group? So both involve all three of those components. All attitudes compose a cognitive component, what you think about the attitude, an affective component, how you feel about that component, whether you like or dislike it, and a behavioral component, how you behave towards that attitude object. So, all attitudes have this cognitive, affective, and behavioral component. And so do our attitudes towards groups of people. We just call them by slightly different names. The cognitive aspect of our attitude of a group, we call our stereotype. The affective part of our stereotype towards a group, we call prejudice. And the behavioral component of our attitude towards a group, we call discrimination. Okay, so all attitudes have those three components. We just call them something a little bit different when we're talking about our attitudes towards groups. All right. Now, quickly, we're going to shift gears to racism because, in a way, you can kind of think of hostile sexism and benign sexism as a very clear and blatant type of sexism and a more subdued, subtle kind of sexism. Well, racism has its blatant and subdued or subtle versions as well. So you have your traditional blatant racism, people going to lynchings, the KKK, neo-Nazis, these in these situations you have people who are clearly and blatantly possessing negative attitudes toward other racial groups, and they in many cases want to harm those racial groups. But then you also have modern racism, and one way to think of it is it's almost like racism gone underground. But it's in the same way that benign sexism is kind of subtle, modern racism is kind of subtle. Many modern racist ideals can be argued. People who have maintained modern racist views can argue, and it even certainly sounds logical, that they are not indeed racist, but they are fighting for equality or something to that effect. So modern racism tends to refer to beliefs that hold that actions that help other groups are bad. So, for example, one modern racist view, or one view that has been called modern racism, is a anti-affirmative action view, because the argument from those who are anti-affirmative action is that these affirmative action policies disadvantage whites, and they give an advantage to blacks and other minority group members. But in actuality, were it not for these affective or affirmative action programs, whites in the country, on average, receive far more opportunities and advantages that minority members tend to not receive. And for that reason, oftentimes there is disproportionate representation of whites and minority members. So, whites make up between 60 and 70% of the American population. And if all things were equal, we would expect that whites would make up 60 to 70% of the population in everything, in every career, in every school, in every university, in the amount of awards being given out. We would expect that whites would only make up 60 to 70% in everything. But they don't. They make more. They make up a greater percentage of that than that. Black Americans, for example, make up between 13 and 16% of the American population. So, if all things were indeed equal, we would expect that Black Americans would make up 13 to 16% of the people in every career, every school, every university, every award given, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But again, they don't. They tend to make up a smaller proportion of things that we might in the culture consider positive. So there are fewer of them in school, there are fewer of them receiving awards, but they make up a greater percentage in things that we might consider negative. So there's more of them in jail, for example, than 13 to 16%. But again, if all things were equal, we would expect the prison population to be made up of between 60 and 70% white people, and about 13 to 16% black people. But again, those proportions don't actually find their way into real life. So affirmative action policies are designed to try and offset some of the inequalities that are kind of built into the system. So it's an attempt to equalize, to create the proportion we would see if indeed things were equal. So they bolster equality. So this is why things like affirmative action are actually designed to enhance equality. And so when you dislike programs like that, you're actually disliking programs that improve equality, which is you're disliking a program meant to enhance equality. So you would prefer to enhance inequality. Which is considered largely a modern racist view. But you see how it could be argued that it isn't racist. So it's a very subtle type of racism. So again, you've got blatant traditional racism, and you've got modern racism, which is more of a subtle thing. You've got hostile sexism, which is very clear, very obvious. You can pretty much see it. And then you have benign sexism, which is a more subdued, a more subtle version. Now, both sexism and racism can be institutionalized. Now, what that means is that sometimes governments, organizations, even universities, the army can institute policies, institute rules that disadvantage one group disproportionately, or advantage one group disproportionately. So, for example, one form of institutionalized sexism is the fact that only men are required to sign up for the draft. Women are not. This is institutionalized sexism because in this situation, it requires men to be available to go to war, but it does not require women to do the same. So that's institutionalized sexism. It's a policy designed to impose a burden or a requirement on one, but doesn't impose it of the other. All right, and you can have similar institutionalized racist policies. You know, the busing policies of old, the segregation policies of old. These were institutionalized racism, and certainly I'm sure there are examples of institutionalized racism today. I mean, you would probably hear an argument that certain policing practices end up being institutionalized racism. So, for example, the steep punishments required of nonviolent drug possession offenses. So, you know, many people might consider this to be an example of institutionalized sexism. All right, so there we go. We've talked about sexism, we've talked about racism, we've talked about blatant and subtle versions of both of them. We've talked about institutionalized sexism and racism, and that is all that I wanted to talk about for this video. If you have any questions, please send them my way, but if not, take it easy.